Good day. Last couple of hours have produced another flood of reports from the battlefronts in Ukraine. The first thing to say is that the Russian advances in Zaporozhye appear to be continuing. There's reports that a settlement called Kamyanske has now been captured by the Russians. This is a village, a large village on the road to the big city of Zaporozhye, one of the big industrial centers of Ukraine, a place whose loss would be of existential significance for Ukraine. If Ukraine were to lose Zaporozhye, it would definitely be seen as a major turning point in the course of the war. Whether the Russians are indeed preparing to capture Zaporozhye, whether that is indeed the purpose of this offensive, is something that I actually personally at the moment rather doubt. I don't get the impression that the Russian forces engaged in this offensive in Zaporozhye region are powerful enough to capture Zaporozhye, but perhaps I'm wrong. Certainly there are reports that the Ukrainian authorities are becoming increasingly worried about Zaporozhye city itself, and there are lots of reports that troops have been rushed there and fortifications in Zaporozhye and in the industrial belt around it are being created in order to try to prepare the city for some sort of Russian attack. Anyway, a Russian advance towards Kamyanske. Now, the other interesting thing about that particular advance is that Kamyanske lies north of a spur, at least so it looks to me, of the Dnieper River, a sort of large inlet or bay of the Dnieper River. And it seems that the Russians didn't bypass it, they didn't go round this spur. They actually seem to have crossed it in some kind of river crossing, which I have to say I find very interesting and very suggestive, and it does beg a lot of questions about what exactly is going on in this area of the combat zone. It suggests that, at least in this part of the Zaporozhye front lines, Ukrainian resistance for the moment continues to be somewhat disorganized. Anyway, there's also reports that the Russians are indeed now closing in on Orekhov. Now, again, I want to stress these are very, very sketchy reports. They may be wrong, but it does seem as if the Russians now have brought their artillery well within striking distance of Orekhov, that it is being taken in some sort of a pincer movement, and that the Russians do seem to be in the process of launching some kind of envelopment of Orekhov, or at least they're acting in a way which might be designed to make the Ukrainians think that that is the case. And lastly, there's also reports, equally sketchy, that there's some kind of Russian advance towards another town in Zaporozhye region, Gulia-Polye, which is apparently a fairly large place with an important history behind it. Anyway, they're said to be fighting now, starting to approach its outskirts. And that's, I have to say, further east, significantly further east of Orekhov and of these other places that I've just been discussing. Now, I would say again, if the Russians really are serious about this advance on Orekhov and indeed on Gulia-Polye, then it does seem to me that the objective is not just to advance, to divert forces, Ukrainian forces, from other areas of the battlefront, but it's most probably a serious attempt to advance further north towards the town of Pavlograd and to cut off Ukrainian supply lines to Zaporozhye city itself. If, of course, the Russians are planning to besiege and capture Zaporozhye city, then this is a major offensive It is a very, very big operation indeed. But as I said, for the moment, I personally think that is unlikely. So that's where we are at the moment with the offensive in Zaporozhye. Before I proceed, I'm going to read again from TASS, the Russian official news agency, a report from a Russian official, a Russian appointed official in Zaporozhye region, who explains Russian tactics. He says the official in question is Yevgeny Balitsky, who we are told is the acting governor of Zaporozhye region. And he's quoted by TASS as saying the following: "At the moment, the situation in the Zaporozhye direction is changing slowly but steadily. The offensive against enemy positions is carrying out using all effective methods in order to inflict the maximum defeat on the enemy without risking the lives of our own servicemen." And TASS then goes on to say that according to Balitsky, tactical reconnaissance is carried out first, followed by artillery preparation fire, and only after all measures that reduce losses among personnel are taken do Russian forces proceed to storm the positions where the enemy is entrenched. And then he quotes Balitsky as saying, "Accordingly, the advance is not rapid but effective. As a result, the enemy losses are much greater. Losses amongst our own servicemen are minimal." And that, by the way, is consistent with what has now become the Russian approach since the start of the war. The Russians do not engage in big armored offensives of the kind, by the way, that the West is talking about in terms of Ukraine launching in order to break through to Melitopol, cut off Crimea, perhaps storm Crimea itself. What the Russians do is they send out reconnaissance parties to find out where the Ukrainian defenses are, to probe the Ukrainian defenses. Then they launch heavy artillery strikes upon those offensives. Then they send infantry to break the Ukrainian defense lines, and that infantry is supported by artillery, to some extent tanks, and only once and if Ukrainian lines are fully broken and there is a Ukrainian collapse, only then are the armored forces unleashed. And this is slow, incremental, methodical, steady progress. We've been seeing this in Donbass, and it's being applied to Zaporozhye as well. And the point is that, as Balitsky says, it's intended, and probably to a great extent achieves, heavy losses amongst the Ukrainian defenders, and as Balitsky says, minimal losses amongst the Russian attackers. It is approach festina lente, Latin, make haste slowly, attributed to no less a person than Caesar Augustus. This was his approach to war. He said, advance slowly, incrementally, methodically, avoid overcommitment, don't put your soldiers at undue risk, don't seek to achieve spectacular results, and just continue gradually, steadily, remorselessly, methodically advancing. And of course, in Caesar Augustus's case, well, he did suffer some big defeats. He lost his legions in the Teutoburg forest, as many people who follow these programs probably know. But overall, the strategy was very successful, and the territorial extent of the Roman Empire doubled during the period of his rule. So that seems to be the approach that the Russians are taking in the Zaporozhye region. It is the approach that the Russians are taking in Donbass, and it is diametrically different from the one that the Ukrainians have been taking and which has been urged upon them by their Western sponsors. And I'm going to come to that shortly when I discuss some of the analyses that have now appeared about the war. Now, that's not just Zaporozhye. the Zaporozhye region where the fighting is going on. I've also seen more reports about the situation in Svatovo and Kremenaya. And perhaps the interesting thing here is that the reports now suggest that the Ukrainians are creating fortifications in the town of Kupiansk, a town which they captured as a result of the Kharkiv counteroffensive that they launched in September, and parts of which lie on the east bank of the Oskol River, other parts of which lie on the west bank of the Oskol River. Anyway, the indications are, the reports suggest that the Ukrainians are now building defences in Kupiansk. Now, if that is the case, then all that heavy equipment, that armoured equipment that is supposed to have arrived in Kupiansk by train, which I talked about yesterday, it looks perhaps as if it is not so much intended to be used in an offensive way against places like Kremenaya and Svatovo. It looks as if it's rather intended to support Ukrainian defense lines in this part of the world in case of a Russian offensive precisely here. So that again is a guess. It may be wrong. The Ukrainians do have a tendency to go on the attack, not always successfully, but we'll just have to wait and see. But as I said, the fact that they're building defences may suggest that the plan here is to preserve these places, Kupiansk, rather than to launch more attacks from them. And then again, there is the situation in Donbass. And here again, we've been getting quite a lot of news. Now, yesterday, I reported that a settlement that the Russian forces, or to be more accurate, the Wagner organization assault forces, have now captured a settlement north of Soledar, and that settlement is now, I can get its name, it's Krasnopoloyevska. And we have a statement from the Donetsk militia, that their Ministry of Defense, their defense headquarters, has reported as of January 23rd, 2023, Russian armed forces liberated Dvoretsye and Krasnopolyevka in the Donetsk People's Republic. And they talk about these places as being north of Soledar. At least that's my understanding of it. Krasnopolyevka definitely is. I'm not quite sure where the other place, Dvoretsye, is. But anyway, the Russians continue to make progress in that part of the battlefield. This is, as I said, the Wagner organization forces. They're continuing their advance. And it looks as if the Russians are, again, steadily, incrementally closing the ring further against Siversk, this town which is the northern hinge of the so-called Zelensky line, and that this seems to be their objective, to take the troops, the Ukrainian troops there, into some sort of operational cauldron, or to force them into an outright retreat. Now, as I said, I've discussed previously that there are lots of Ukrainian reports that General Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian forces, has urged President Zelensky to pull Ukrainian troops out of Siversk, but there is absolutely no sign up to this time that he is doing so. Now, I'm also getting lots of reports about the fighting in and around Bakhmut. And I said in a recent video that I've now seen pictures of shell fire, Russian shells, smoke coming from Russian shells, right in the center of Bakhmut. Also around a monument, a Soviet-era monument of a MiG-17 fighter jet, an old 1950s Soviet fighter jet is obviously put up as a kind of monument in Bakhmut. I'm not sure why, by the way, but it is there. It's apparently a favorite place has been a favorite place for Ukrainian soldiers and foreign volunteer fighters who've joined the Ukrainian army to have themselves photographed. Well, that old area around that monument seems to be the target of heavy shelling. And it's clear that, as I said, this fighting is now creeping into the center of Bakhmut from the suburbs. And there's more reports that the villages of Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovorye, I'm probably getting the name of this place again wrong, two villages to the north of Bakhmut, are also now being methodically stormed by the troops of the Wagner organization. Storming villages, as we've seen, can take a long time in this part of the world, so it doesn't mean that they're going to be captured tomorrow, even if the Wagner forces have broken through the outermost defenses. The Ukrainians tend to try and hold on to specific buildings within these villages. But anyway, the direction of the fighting is clear. It's only a question of time before these villages are captured as well. But perhaps the most interesting and, from a Ukrainian point of view, I would have thought alarming development is that Russian artillery is now apparently operating. This is medium-range artillery, is now operating on the outskirts of a town called Chasov Yar, which is, as I understand it, to the west of Bakhmut. Now, Chasov Yar is an important logistical and military hub. If the Russian artillery is operating there, then it suggests that there's significant Russian military units now operating to the west of Bakhmut, and there's also now lots of confirmation of fighting in the village of Ivanovka. To the west of Bakhmut, Ivanovka lies along one of the main roads into Bakhmut, the one from the west, and it seems to be the only big road left that Ukraine can still use to send troops and supplies into Bakhmut and from Bakhmut. And it does look as if the Ukrainian position in Bakhmut continues to deteriorate. Again, it deteriorates slowly, but it does so consistently. Every hour, it gets a little worse, and of course, every hour, more Ukrainian soldiers die. Of course, it's not just Ukrainian soldiers who die in these battles. Undoubtedly, Russian soldiers die as well. Highly likely that the Wagner organization assault troops have suffered significant losses in capturing Bakhmut. But as I said, as I was saying in my previous video, all the indications are that it is the Ukrainians who are suffering by far the heaviest losses in the fighting in and around Bakhmut, despite heroic attempts by some in the Western media and in Ukraine itself to, if you like, flip the script to pretend that it is, on the contrary, the Russians who are suffering the heavy losses in this area. And going back to that, there's comments by Mr. Belitsky, the governor of Zaporozhye. Of course, in Donbass, the Russians have been following this practice of sending first reconnaissance groups, then artillery, then infantry backed by tanks and armoured vehicles in order to storm particular positions, that they do it steadily and incrementally rather than in one big surge. And this is exactly what we've been seeing in Bakhmut. And as Mr. Belitsky says, it's an approach designed to inflict the greatest possible casualties on the enemy, in this case Ukraine, whilst at the same time limiting the losses that the Russian military faces. And again, I'm not going to get into numbers of losses. It's something I really don't like doing, by the way. But as I said already and previously, despite the fact that it's the Russians who are on the attack, all the indications are that it is the Ukrainians who are suffering the heaviest losses in these battles. By the way, and before I finish this overall summary of developments on the battlefields, I ought to say two things. Firstly, it seems that the Russian Air Force has been quite active in Zaporozhye region, supporting the Russian offensive there, more active than it's been perhaps in other parts of the battlefields. And secondly, that one of the factors that limits the speed of Russian advance apparently are these very dense minefields that Ukraine has been laying in front of its defenses. I'm sure that the Russians are also planting mines on a massive scale in front of their own defenses in Zaporozhye region and in the Svatovo-Kremenaya region. There's almost no discussion, in fact I have seen no discussion in the West about the effect of mines in this war, even though it appears to be very considerable indeed. And I would have thought, this is my own inexpert view, that large belts of mines planted in all these sort of places are also going to complicate any kind of armoured offensives of the sort that some people who support Ukraine and who are rubbing their hands in anticipation of Leopard 2 tank deliveries, that those people are thinking about. Anyway, I also want to say something about the Wagner organization, because the United States has now said that it considers the Wagner organization to be a criminal group. I'm not entirely certain quite why that is so. I mean, what the rationale is. Certainly it does recruit large numbers of men from Russia's prison population, and these young men who serve in the Wagner organization and fight in its battles are able to obtain pardons and release back into civilian life. But as I've said, the Russians are not unique in this. The French Foreign Legion has been doing this for, well, significant, almost 2 centuries since its first foundation. In fact, there's whole novels about how the French Foreign Legion recruits its troops and the fact that it recruits criminals, not, very, very serious criminals, not murderers or people of that kind, but certainly petty criminals are often recruited into the French Foreign Legion and have been historically. Well, that doesn't seem to, that comparison is never made with the Wagner organization. The fact that the Wagner organization is operating in this conflict area, well, private military contractors, if that is what the Wagner organization actually is, I've made clear my own doubts about that, well, that isn't so unusual. It happens again in many conflict zones. And by the way, the legality or otherwise of any particular conflict has never applied, has never been something that anybody has raised before. I mean, there have been mercenaries, if you like to call them that, fighting in many of the wars in Latin America and Africa. And as I said, that's not usually resulted in them being classified as criminals merely for the act of doing so. On the contrary, as those who follow my programs know, I have actually objected when the Russians have treated Western fighters, Western soldiers who volunteered to fight on the Ukrainian side and who've taken out contracts to fight on the Ukrainian side and who've been mercenaries, when the Russians don't acknowledge these people as combatants and have claimed that the Geneva Conventions do not apply to them. I've made known my strong objections to this practice. Well, it seems to me that the United States has gone a whole step further. It's now denying effective combatant status to the Wagner organization. It's treating Wagner operatives as straightforward criminals engaging in criminal activity, which means, of course, that if they're captured, they can be denied the protections of the Geneva Convention, something which I have to say I find extremely disturbing indeed. And because the United States has now extended this umbrella title to the Wagner organization, it presumably applies to wherever these operatives now work. So, for example, if they operate in West Africa and are somehow captured or arrested there by Western forces, they're effectively going to be treated as criminals, irrespective of what they might actually have done. So I think this is a very dangerous extension of concepts of criminal liability into military conflicts, and I think this is a disturbing precedent, but of course it is an entirely typical one. It is not going to make any difference, by the way, to the developments in the battlefields. Well, that's what I wanted to say about that, and I think now I'm going to turn to some of the analyses of the war, and I'm going to look at two American ones and one Russian, and I'm going to start with the Russian, and it's one that I found on Slavyangrad. And let me repeat again, Slavyangrad is a channel, a telegram channel, which takes a strongly pro-Russian position in the war. I have consistently found it reliable. It is often very critical of the Russian authorities, and I find many of the analyses that it provides insightful. Now, this is one it's provided, and this is comparing the Zaporozhye offensive with the Russia's Zaporozhye offensive with Russia's previous withdrawal from Kharkiv region at the time of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv region. And I think I'm not going to read the whole of this commentary, but I'm going to read what I think are the salient parts of it, because I think that they're full of insight. And it says this: the Ukrainian military has found themselves in a dilemma due to their desire to hold on to territory, even to the last man. Ultimately, Kiev's goals are propaganda and real estate, with little regard to how many men end up in body bags. Now, that, of course, is, as I said, it's a Russian point of view, but you can see the point they're making. They're saying that the Ukrainians cling on to territory. They're prepared to lose large numbers of men to cling on to every millimeter of territory. And this is indisputably true. I've been discussing this right through the whole war. I've both been baffled by it and concerned about it, and frankly, on many occasions, upset by it. And anyway, to continue, at the time of the Kharkiv counteroffensive by the Ukrainian army in September, Russia had not yet begun the partial mobilization, and the Russian army did not have the luxury of manpower nor the exogenous supply from outside forces that the Ukrainian military has now come to rely upon. This is completely true, by the way. Whilst things should never have been allowed to unfold as they did, costing us, which is to say the Russians, Liman and the greater portion of Kharkiv, at that time and place, the correct decision was made to withdraw across the Oskol River to buy time and protect precious manpower. And I, by the way, agree again with that analysis entirely, given the fact that the Russians were very short of troops at the time of the Ukrainian September offensive in Kharkiv region. The Russians did undoubtedly the right thing when they pulled their forces across the Oskol River and abandoned places like Izium and eventually Kupiansk to Ukraine. And then this analyst goes on to contrast the approach taken by Ukraine. Conversely, the Ukrainian military, focusing on territory and propaganda, has decided to dig in hard for Bakhmut, Artyomovsk. Of course, these are the same places, but it's different names for one and the same place. Even redeploying troops from other fronts. By doing this, their garrisons in Zaporozhye have found themselves in a similar position to those of the Russian military in Kharkiv. Of course, I do not expect them to withdraw, as the Russians did, but rather to fight a suicidal defense on multiple fronts. Ultimately, the result will be the same, just with heavier losses. Now, as to the last, well, we'll just have to wait and see whether, in fact, as I said, the Russians press their current advantage, their current offensive in Zaporozhye in quite the same way, and whether Ukraine does indeed lose large amounts of territory in Zaporozhye, as this analyst or commentator appears to think. But the essential point this person is making is absolutely correct. The Ukrainians are overwhelmingly focused on territory, partly because of its media effect, the media effect of capturing and holding it. They don't like retreating, and they like to capture territory, and they're prepared to spend extraordinary numbers of men's lives in order both to hold territory, as they've been doing in Bakhmut and in Donbass, and in order to capture territory, as they did in Kharkiv, and as they also did in Kherson region in the offensives that took place over the course of the autumn. And this is extremely costly to themselves, and it causes many men to die, and it also depletes Ukraine's weapons pool. It means that Ukraine is constantly finding itself at different points in the war severely short of weapons, and then it has to come and beg its Western sponsors for more, which it then quickly burns up all over again. Now, the Russian approach is completely different. They work to conserve their manpower and their weapons. Now, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has been discussing this at length, but we see Mr. Balitsky, the governor of the Zaporozhye region, the Russian-appointed governor of the Zaporozhye region, has said exactly this. He said that the offensive in Zaporozhye region is carried out using all effective methods in order to inflict the maximum defeat on the enemy, in other words, the greatest number of losses on the enemy without risking the lives of our servicemen. So the Russians are prepared to retreat rather than lose lives of their soldiers and lose equipment, as they showed they were prepared to do both in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region. And when they do go on to the offensive, they do so gradually and incrementally and methodically. They don't want to throw large numbers of lives away, and they certainly do not practice the kind of human wave tactics that in the Western media and in Ukraine is often attributed to them. So I thought that was an interesting analysis of the Russian approach to the war. Let's now turn to two American articles, and they both come, I should say, from Responsible Statecraft, which is the journal of the Internet Journal of the Quincy Institute. And the first one deals with the question of weapons supplies. And I'm not going to read the entirety of this article, but again, I do think it's interesting. And it says there are a host of reasons, backed by historical examples, why sending more and more advanced weapons into Ukraine will not be a panacea. In fact, sending them might boomerang against the United States at some point. This is an argument for caution, as it looks like the West is willing to send more of its most sophisticated equipment into Ukraine to win the peace. And then the article talks about the joint Washington Post op-ed by Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates, Time is Not on Ukraine's Side, which with its implicit admission that Ukraine is losing the war, and its call for America to act with urgency, and the way in which this is now leading to demands to send more and more weapons to Ukraine, ever more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine. And the article points out that the United States used some of its most sophisticated weapons in the attack on Iraq in March 2003. And initially, they seemed to be very successful. We had shock and awe. But then, as the article goes on to say, in places such as Fallujah, Ramadi, and Baghdad, Iraqi insurgents canalized the greatest maneuver force in the world into narrow streets littered with improvised explosive devices, commonly known as roadside bombs. And then it says that this eventually caused the United States to suffer significant losses in Iraq, as it found itself constantly ground down, in effect, or bogged down in this sort of street fighting. And of course, it then culminated in the disaster when a certain Islamic group, I'm not going to name it, but I think we can all guess which I'm referring to, captured Iraqi cities in the west of Iraq and established its so-called caliphate, capturing, as it says, 2,300 Humvees, 52 M198 howitzers, 74,000 machine guns, and 40 Abrams tanks, and lots of other American-made systems. And we've had similar things happening in other places, and it points out that in Afghanistan, the Taliban again adapted themselves to American tactics. They were able to capture and pass on, apparently, to Iran devices like the RQ-170 Sentinel drone, and the use of these very advanced weapons eventually enabled Iran to catapult its development of its own very large drone program by essentially reverse engineering the American drones that had been used over the conflict in Afghanistan. Now, I have to say I'm a little surprised by this because I've not heard this before, but I'm assuming that it's true. And then the article goes on to discuss the limited effectiveness of the HIMARS. And it says, it's something to keep in mind is how easily conventional armies can adapt. And again, reading this article, in 2022, Ukraine took possession of at least 20 US HIMARS multiple rocket launcher systems, a technology only previously shared with NATO allies. Additionally, the Advanced Rocket Artillery System is a pillar of the Marine Corps Force Design 2030 concept, centered on defending the littorals in the Pacific from potential Chinese encroachment. And it then goes on to say, in 2022, the US Army requested $1 billion in funding for precision missiles fired from HIMARS, primarily from HIMARS, for use in the Pacific. It would be naive to think that the Russians will not share their experience contending with HIMARS with China, with which Russia engages in military drills on a regular basis now. And in fact, from Russian sources, we know that they have captured intact HIMARS missiles and that they've been sent to high-level Russian design offices, and the Russians there have been reverse engineering them and examining them. And this has not been talked about in unofficial Russian telegram channels. I've actually seen it in the mainstream Russian media and confirmed by Russian officials. And the article goes on to say such a development, if the Russians share the information they have about this technology with the Chinese, which, by the way, they are certain to do, such a development could severely degrade vital elements of the new Pacific strategy, such as MCFD 2030, before it is even implemented. Then comes the key, for me, the killer section. Besides that, analysis from the Foreign Policy Research Institute states that Russia has already adapted to the presence of HIMARS and may already have enough information to have the edge over the system. According to the report from Rob Lee and Michael Kaufman, despite HIMARS having an immediate impact on the battlefield, Russian forces adapted within weeks, significantly reducing its effectiveness. Whilst detailing Russian adaptations, Lee and Kaufman wrote, the overall effect of HIMARS may be overstated and its impact levelled off after the first 2 months of use on the battlefield. So, HIMARS has only had a limited effect. Why assume that other systems, like, say, the Leopard 2 main battle tank, is going to be that much more dramatically effective? And the article goes on. We should not let this, we have strong emotions, but we should not let about, the war in Ukraine, but we should not let this convince us that flooding Ukraine with even more advanced weaponry is a panacea for the conflict. We would be wise to remember how similar policies in Afghanistan and Iraq sent the boomerang careening back at us. Will this latest batch of weapons headed to Ukraine finally win the peace? Whilst this is possible, do we fully understand what we are giving up to do so? As history shows, no matter how advanced a weapon is, someone will eventually figure out a way to counter it. This is completely true. And by the way, this article omits perhaps the most extreme example of this, which was, of course, the war in Vietnam, where the United States, as I am old enough to remember, sent ever more advanced weapons to fight the war in Vietnam, and found that none of them gave it the kind of victory that perhaps it expected. And that now brings me to the second article by someone called Branko Marketic. And this is a very interesting article, I think a very important one, and I'm going to read it in full. And it's about mission creep. And it says the following: mission creep, ? How the US role in Ukraine has slowly escalated. And it goes on to say the Biden team has quietly blown past red lines of involvement. The question now is, how far is it willing to go? And the article, the body of the article, I'm going to read it in full because it's relatively short and it is not behind a paywall. Anyway, the article says the following: when the United States involves itself militarily in a conflict, it often finds it hard to get itself out, let alone avoid deep entanglements that blow well past lines it has drawn at the start of the intervention. It happened in Vietnam when US military advisors helping the South Vietnamese fight the Viet Cong eventually became US soldiers fighting an American war. Now, I think I'm right in saying that I am the first person on this channel who on this channel made comparisons between American policy in the 1960s in Vietnam, which led to the catastrophic consequences that we all know, and American policies in this war in Ukraine, which I have no doubt will lead to at least equally bad catastrophic consequences, and perhaps far worse consequences even than those. Anyway, the article goes on to say, it happened in Afghanistan when an initial invasion to capture Al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban morphed into a nearly 2-decade-long nation-building project. And it could be happening right now in Ukraine. Little by little, NATO and the United States are creeping closer to the catastrophic scenario President Biden said we must strive to prevent: direct conflict between the United States and Russia. Despite stressing at the start of the war that our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict, current and former intelligence officials told The Intercept back in October that there is a much larger presence of both CIA and US Special Operations personnel in Ukraine than there was when Russia invaded, conducting clandestine American operations in the country that are now far more extensive. Amongst those clandestine operations, investigative journalists and former Green Beret Jack Murphy reported on December 24th to little mainstream attention is the CIA's work with an unnamed NATO ally's spy agency to carry out sabotage operations within Russia, reportedly the cause of the unexplained explosions that have rocked Russian infrastructure throughout the war. This is the kind of activity that skirts dangerously close to direct NATO-Russia confrontation. Now, can I just make a quick observation about this? The first thing to say is that way back in 2017, there was an article, as I remember, in the Washington Post, which said that the United States, through its various intelligence agencies, had planted cyber bombs in parts of the Russian infrastructure system, which the United States would activate in any given situation. Well, I wonder whether some of these infrastructure explosions might have been connected with some kind of cyber campaign of that nature, which was perhaps conducted alongside some other intelligence agency, Britain's perhaps, I don't know. But anyway, if so, I'm going to make one quick observation. Over the last few weeks, months even, I've noticed that those explosions seem to have tailed off. I wonder whether the Russians have found some means either to counter them, perhaps if they were carried out by operatives, they've all been rounded up, or possibly, if they were cyber attacks, whether the Russians have somehow hardened their facilities against these kind of cyber attacks, or whether perhaps the Russians have threatened counteraction against the United States and its NATO allies if that kind of operation continues. That's purely a guess. I don't know. I just mention it. I have noticed that there's been a decline in these incidents over the last few months. Anyway, to continue with the article, to put it into perspective, consider the way that swathes of the US political establishment viewed the mere act of Russian meddling in the 2016 election as an act of war, outrageous, but orders of magnitude less serious than helping to carry out infrastructure attacks on another country's soil. Meanwhile, the United States and its NATO allies have serially blown past their own self-important lines over arms transfers. At the start of the war, the New York Times cautioned that the overt supply of even small arms and light weaponry risks encouraging a wider war and possible retaliation from Moscow, whilst US officials ruled out more advanced weaponry as too escalatory. It took less than 2 months for the Biden administration to start sending these more risky tranches of high-powered arms. By the end of May, it was sending advanced rocket systems that just weeks earlier it had considered too escalatory on the strict condition that Ukraine wouldn't use them to strike inside Russian territory, something they feared could spark escalation drawing in NATO, until that line too was eventually breached. The Pentagon admitted this past December it had given Ukraine the go-ahead to attack targets in Russia, after all, in response to Moscow's destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure. The fear of escalation has changed since the beginning, one defense official explained to the Times of London, with the Pentagon less worried ever since Russian President Vladimir Putin pulled back on his nuclear threats in October. As Ukraine's war effort has stalled and Russian forces have made small advances, NATO arms transfers have now escalated well beyond what governments had worried just months ago could draw the alliance into direct war with Russia, with the US and European governments now sending armoured vehicles and reportedly preparing to send tanks. Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov had predicted as much in October last year. When I was in Washington in November, before the invasion, and asked for stingers, they told me it was impossible, he told the New Yorker. Then it became possible. When I asked for 155mm guns, the answer was no. HIMARS, no. HARM, no. Now all of that is yes. Therefore, I'm certain tomorrow that there will be tanks and ATACMS and F-16s. It remains to be seen how long before US opposition to such military aid goes the way of its earlier opposition to heavy weaponry it's already sent, or how long the administration will continue to hold out on sending longer-range drones, which a bipartisan group of senators is currently pushing for, and which Russian officials have explicitly warned would make Washington a direct party to the conflict. As the nature of arms transfers has expanded, so have war aims. The alliance's initial goals were to help Ukraine defend its independence and sovereignty by repelling a Russian invasion bent on regime change. By the way, Alexei Arestovich, now freed from his job, liberated from his job as Zelensky's spin doctor, has just given an interview in which he has admitted that the Russians came in incredibly soft at the start of the war and appeared to be keen to negotiate in earnest. Doesn't look as if they were seeking regime change at the start of the war, but I say that in parenthesis. Anyway, to continue. 2 months later, US officials were publicly talking about victory and inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia that would leave it weakened. Biden has repeatedly vowed to support Ukraine as long as it takes, even as Zelensky and other officials have made repeatedly clear that goals are now to retake Crimea, something that could spark nuclear escalation. Talk of diplomacy is again nearly absent from US commentary on the war, far outnumbered by calls for drastic escalation of NATO involvement to achieve Ukrainian victory, often on the basis that any other result would deal an existential blow to the West and the entire liberal global order. If Russia wins the war in Ukraine, we will see decades of this kind of behaviour ahead of us. Finland's progressive Prime Minister Sanna Marin recently said at Davos as she pledged to back the Ukrainian war effort for 15 years if necessary. We have to make sure that in the end Ukrainians will win. I don't think that there's any other choice. And it seems as of last week, the Biden administration is poised to cross yet another red major line, with the New York Times reporting that US officials are strongly considering giving Ukraine the green light to attack Crimea, even whilst acknowledging the risk of nuclear retaliation that such a move would carry. Fears of such an escalation have dimmed, US officials tell the paper. By escalating the support for Ukraine's military, the US and NATO have created an incentive structure for Moscow to take a drastic, aggressive step to show the seriousness of its own red lines. This would be dangerous at the best of times, but particularly so when Russian officials are making clear they increasingly view the war as one against NATO as a whole, not merely Ukraine, while threatening nuclear response to the alliance's escalation in weapons deliveries. NATO governments are increasingly painting the conflict to their publics not as a limited effort to help one country repel an invasion from a larger neighbour, but rather as an existential battle for the survival of the West, mirrored in the Russian leadership's own evolving view of the war as a battle for survival against hostile Western powers. I would add that I would qualify that the Russians have seen it in that way from the outset. Even before the war, the Russians were talking about the fact that the West's NATO expansion and constant movement of its nuclear forces ever closer to Russia's borders had left Russia nowhere to retreat to. And one only has to read Putin's address to the Russian people at the start of the conflict to see how starkly the Russian leadership already saw, even at that time, this conflict in existential terms. All that has happened is that Western escalation has, to the Russian mind, proved those initial fears true. Anyway, to continue the article, if the intention is to keep this war a limited regional one between two neighbouring states, with NATO playing only a peripheral supporting role, all of these trend lines point in the opposite direction. Unless officials make a concerted effort to de-escalate and pursue a diplomatic track, and prominent voices in the media and politics create the political space for them to do it, Biden's vow to avoid World War III will mean as much as President Johnson's 1964 promise not to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. So there you are. And I think this article has got this exactly correct. What has happened is that the United States is trapped, just as it was in Vietnam, in an escalation cycle. It is trapped in that cycle not because Ukraine is winning the war, it is because Ukraine is losing the war. Ukraine would have collapsed militarily perhaps around the end of May or June last year if it had not received the kind of military assistance and economic assistance it is now receiving from the West. And what that means is that as Ukraine has become increasingly dependent on the West for its survival, it has become increasingly an investment from which the West finds it very difficult to walk away from. And with every Russian advance, just as with every Vietnamese advance, North Vietnamese advance in the war in South Vietnam in the 1960s, the pressure is therefore on in the United States to commit further, to escalate more, to pass whatever notional red lines the United States had set for itself, barring possible escalation. And by the way, as was the case in the 1960s with the war in Vietnam, since straightforwardly admitting that the war was being lost is politically impossible. The rhetoric is always framed not as avoiding military disaster, but rather as achieving the conditions for certain victory. So we have people talking about helping Ukraine with its next counteroffensive, even as others like Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates tell us that Ukraine is losing the war and is running out of time. Now, this is an incredibly dangerous cycle, and I have to say I see no sign that the United States government is prepared to break out of this escalatory cycle. President Johnson in the 1960s at all times had doubts about the escalatory cycle he'd found himself trapped in. His major focus was on the very ambitious domestic agenda he had for the United States itself, his so-called Great Society program. But he found it impossible to control the hardliners, the precursors, if you like, of the neocons within his own administration and within the media. People like, for example, the journalist Joseph Alsop and many others like that. Unfortunately, I get the sense that in the case of this administration, there is not even that very limited restraint provided by a skeptical president. If Johnson does seem to have had genuine doubts, as far as I can see, President Biden today is himself a hardliner. He has shown no real desire to limit the escalatory cycle or to contain the escalatory cycle. On the contrary, he seems keen on pressing on, well, I'm not sure to what eventual purpose or what end. And I'm going to say this, I've said this before, I think that in contrast to Vietnam, which was always ultimately a military conflict, one of the great problems with this conflict is that it was never, in its original intention, intended to be just that. I come back to what I've said many times. The initial super response that the United States and its allies have put together, the real intention or motivation behind the conflict was to provide grounds for this massive sanctions attack on Russia, which it was expected would level the Russian economy and precipitate a political crisis in Moscow. Well, the president gives every impression of having been a full advocate of that policy. It didn't work, and because it didn't work, and because accepting a negotiated solution to the crisis is unimaginable for him, and because obviously allowing Ukraine to fall to defeat is also unimaginable for him, because it would mean the failure of his principal foreign policy objective, which is to engineer regime change in Moscow. He has trapped himself and the United States in a policy of unendingly doubling down. Now, that unfortunately means that if there's going to be a block, if there's going to be a moment when this runaway train finally hits the buffers, if there are buffers that can stop a runaway train, well, that will have to be some kind of external check It will not come from within the administration itself. If President Johnson was eventually prepared, after massive protests and enormous opposition, including from the military establishment, to authorise the opening of negotiations in Paris with the Vietnamese, and also to stop the United States bombing campaign, Rolling Thunder, I think it is going to be far more difficult to persuade this president to change direction. Now, where that will lead us is another matter, one which I'm going to have to discuss in my next programs or follow-up programs. But anyway, I thought I would just bring us up to date. And as I said, these have been 3 interesting pieces which I wanted to discuss today. Thank you for joining me once more. More from me soon. Remember, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And last but not least, please remember that you can go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats and hoodies, and t-shirts and other such things. And also, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day, another long video. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.